Again, my name is Julia. I'm a product manager in the Azure API Management organization here at Microsoft. Today, I will be talking about Azure API Center. So Azure API Center is a brand new Azure service. We are currently in public preview. And something we are seeing today with a lot of customers, or what is this product all about, is APIs are really expanding at a remarkable speed. More and more customers adopting to an API-first strategies. They are using APIs for connecting different systems, for building different systems. So we really see a big growth here for APIs. But with a lot of growth, there also comes a lot of challenges. So one of these challenges, for example, API sprawl. But what does it mean and what kind of challenges are these? So APIs are being deployed across different services, across different platforms, across different gateways, right? And with this deployment everywhere, this can lead to a lack of visibility for all kinds of different API stakeholders, like API developers, for example, or API managers or API program managers. And with this lack of visibility, it becomes really hard to keep track of all of your organizational APIs out there and their deployment location, their configurations, their API specifications. And this is exactly where Azure API Center comes in, and one of the challenges we really want to tackle with Azure API Center. So as I mentioned, Azure API Center, it's a brand new Azure service. It's currently in public preview. And what is Azure API Management? So we really want to narrow down to create your organizational API hub for all of your APIs out there. And whenever we look at Azure API Center, what are the three themes we currently see within Azure API Center? One is creating and maintaining an organizational inventory. So we want you to be able to create this inventory of all of your organizational APIs out there to make it reusable, to make it transparent to all of these API stakeholders out there, and all of this in one single place. The second one is API governance. One step of API governance is having this one repository, this one place where all of your APIs are being tracked. The other addition to it is maybe you want to store additional information to your APIs. And this is where we are introducing the concept of custom metadata. And last but not least, API discovery is also a huge pain point we want to tackle with API Center. API Center or API discovery can be done via the Azure portal experience, but also via API Center portal experience. So you don't have to grant access everyone to your API Azure portal experience. You can use API Center portal to provide this kind of discovery experience for all of different API stakeholders out there. For example, API developers, API managers, for example. Talking about API developers, we also want to meet developers where they are at, especially API developers. And that's why we also, for API discovery purposes, are introducing a Visual Studio Code extension for API Center. But yeah, let me show you what all of this means in action. I have a demo prepared to show you what Azure API Center looks like in Azure, but also talk a little bit about the Visual Studio Code extension here. So I'm currently in Azure. I currently have set up an API Center instance here. So what does the current experience look like? We talked about APIs and having this one single place where you can store all of your APIs. As you can see, I already registered a bunch of APIs here. And we have multiple ways or different ways to register APIs. One is a manual way via the Azure portal experience. Another one is a more automated way because we love automation. And especially from an enterprise perspective, you want to make this process as easy as possible. Before I show you how to import APIs, let's touch on the topic of custom metadata, right? We talked about it whenever we talk about API governance. So again, custom metadata is a way to store additional information on top of your APIs. Currently, I have 4 example custom metadatas set up here. One is API approver, cost center, compliance status, and test. There are different data types coming with your custom metadata, so it's super flexible depending on what is some of the information you want to store on top of your APIs. All right, let's talk about how can I bring or register new APIs into my API Center instance. Let's imagine I'm a .NET developer. I'm currently in Visual Studio Code. I'm building out a very simple weather API with one very basic controller here. I have a get operation. So I want to get date, temperature, and summary of my weather data. We all know the good old weather API. So again, very simple weather API. One asset I'm creating based on my controller, based on my definition, is an OpenAPI spec. And now this is the only thing we need for registering a new API in API Center. I talked about automation. I talked about how much we want to make it as easy as possible. So for this, I'm using our Azure CLI. And with just one single line of command, you can easily generate a new API within your Azure portal. Let me hit the enter button here. And what will happen here under the hood is, first of all, we are referencing our resource group. We are referencing our API Center portal and also an API location. This API location can be within a file, or it can be pointing to a URL to make it as easy as possible, again, for you to take your API, to take your spec and bringing it into your API Center. So what happens under the hood? We are creating a new API in API Center. We are detecting the API version. We are detecting the API definition and are uploading the API specification here. So let's check on the API Center portal if this has been refreshed here. For this, of course, I have to switch to my API tab here. And perfect. You can see my new API has been registered. And again, it comes with the version. It comes with the OpenAPI spec. We talked about custom metadata. So I defined 4 custom metadata properties, and these I want to add within my API Center portal. So I can easily just go in here and provide some of the functionalities, marketing, just some information. And I also want to store the compliance status, which is currently still open because nobody of my API managers has taken a look at this yet. And then just a test property as well. And let me hit the save button. Perfect. So additional information is being stored on top of your APIs. All right, so we talked about registering API. We talked about custom metadata. What about the API discovery experience? For this, we are introducing the API Center portal, which comes with every API Center instance you're creating an API Center. And that's what the current experience looks like. I'm not signed in yet. So let me show you what the process here looks like. I created a user here. I, of course, have to provide my credentials. All right, what's happening? Currently, I'm not authorized to access this portal because, of course, access should be controlled. So this is where we can switch back, and via access control, we added a role so that you are in charge of who is available to see all of these APIs out there. So let me add a new role here, or a new user to my API Center data API reader. I can go in here, search for my members who I want to grant access to my API Center portal, and hit the review and assign button. This means I'm now adding a role, and perfect. This has been done for me. Let's check on what the experience now looks like. Let me close on it. Let me sign in again, and perfect. Now, because I have access, I'm able to see all of my organizational APIs out there. So what can you do within the API Center portal? You can search for APIs. You can filter for certain APIs. There are different ways to displace APIs as well, depending on what you prefer, what you want to do. But you can also share your APIs, either via email or by copying a link and maybe sending it or referring this to another developer, to another API stakeholder here. If I click in more detail, and let's search for our perfect weather API that I just recently added. Some things you can do, you can of course download the API definition, depending on which version you want to check out, which definition format you want to get from this API. This is what I meant at the beginning when we are detecting your API version as well, depending on what you have stored within your API definition. And we will retrieve this information and put it into API Center here as well. All right, so this is one piece of the API discovery journey. The other one is our Visual Studio Code extension. We really want to create this product for our API developers out there. So this is where our extension comes in. Let me open up my API Center here so you can see what the experience looks like. This is our current API Center extension. You can see, I can see the API Center instance itself, and I can see all of the APIs that come with my API Center instance here. We are working together with our Copilot team because we wanted to create a really nice developer experience. What if you don't necessarily know what is the API I want to search for? What are some of the APIs I can find? So this is where you can use Copilot to help you with your developer experience here. Currently, we support two different functionalities. One is, for example, list. And as soon as you hit this one, Copilot will retrieve you a list of all of the APIs out there that you can find in API Center. It will provide you the title, the description, and the operations coming with it. And this in a very quick and easy way for you to see, oh, what are all of the APIs out there? What are some of the descriptions? What are some of the operations? If you already know what kind of API you're looking for, you can use our /find. And right now, let's think I know I want to find an API, something with cats. So let's hit my enter button here. Let's see what Copilot does for me. Perfect. It found me one API that matches my search criteria. Currently, we have a cat fact API within our Azure API Center instance, and these are the operations coming with it. So I'm getting a quick overview of, first of all, what this API is, a little bit of a description, and all of the operations that come with it as well. Let's check if this is actually accurate. So I can go back to my extension. I already have my cat facts API open, and you can see in our definition folder, here's the open API spec that I'm looking for. Within our extension, we support three functionalities. One is opening API documentation. So let's do this. And this is where a Swagger preview file will be auto-generated for you in your IDE. So you don't have to leave it. And you can either test it, you can find out all about these operations. So let's check on Copilot. Currently, I see I have three operations, three get operations. If I check what Copilot told me, perfect. Yes, I'm getting the same information here. It's just a different way of discovering these APIs to getting information about all of your APIs out there in your API Center. All right, so what else can I do? Let's go back to my weather API and let's see what I can do here as well. Or maybe let's take a different API. This seems like there has been some uploading issues. But again, so I'm searching for my open API spec here. Another functionality that I want to do is generate an HTTP file. So I can use a different extension for me to actually test and test and get some more exposure to this API as well. The other way always is opening up the API definition. Again, I can test within my Visual Studio extension here as well. So let's see if this works. Perfect, I'm getting a 200 and my body responds here as well. Last but not least, the last operation we are supporting is generating an API client for you. So as a developer, and let's pick the example of I'm building a web application, and within my web application, I want to use some of my APIs. How do I do this? Ideally, I want to have a client. So this is where Azure API Center comes in. You can auto-generate an API client based on your open API spec or based on the APIs you have within your API Center instance. And this is as easy as selecting which of the endpoints you want to expose via the client. And you can pick and choose if you want to have this within your client, yes or no, and then just easily hitting on the play button here. And this will auto-generate your API client so you can reference it in any other projects like your web application that you're building for a different use case. All right, let me quickly summarize what we have seen today. So we have seen create and maintain an organizational inventory. We went into API Center, we saw what the experience looks like in Azure. We talked about the APIs you can see there. We talked about access control for API discovery. So these are some of the things you can do with your inventory for your organizational APIs. Then we also talked about governance. We talked about custom metadata. We saw how easy it is to add a new API into API Center and to add additional information that you previously defined as custom metadata. And finally, we talked about API discovery in two ways. One, via the Azure API Center portal experience, and then the other experience via our Visual Studio Code extension from a definitely more developer perspective, but just for you to see what are all of these APIs out there. You don't want to leave your IDE. We want to meet developers where they are at. So yeah, to wrap this up, as I mentioned, we are still in public preview. GA is currently planned for March 2024. What are some of the things we are working on? For inventory, we want to support bulk import, especially APIs from API management. We love automation. We talked about this. So we want to support functionalities or support for GitHub Actions and DevOps pipelines as well. From a governance perspective, we are currently working on an integration with Logic apps. So API managers or API program managers can build custom workflows based on certain trigger events happening in your API Center instance. And then last but not least, for governance, API guidelines or API design guidelines is something that becomes really important, especially if you're bringing a bunch of API specifications into your API Center. So we are currently working on what does it mean from an API Center perspective to design or create these API guidelines, and ideally to also link these API specifications and get some kind of recommendations, what you have to do from the perspective of your APIs, what you have to change and to make them really compliant for your organization here as well. And then again, from an API discovery standpoint, we talked about the Visual Studio Code extension. We will definitely add more features, more functionalities here as well. And then from a portal perspective, we saw the API Center portal experience here. To make it more customizable, we are currently working with Backstage to provide a plugin. So customers out there can create an API Center portal that really fits their needs. And depending on their recommendations on their needs, they can really create their own custom API Center portal experience here using the Backstage plugin. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. Feel free to reach out to us if you have either any feedback for us, any problems. Always happy to chat and hear what your current experience is with Azure API Center. And now back to the studio. Thank you.
So we do have a few questions for you, Julia, and we do have a few minutes as well if you're open for it.
Yeah.
And Pierce has been answering some of these, so some of these might end up being duplicates. But let's start with Ritu. He talks about from where do we access this portal? It's not easy to get this on the API Center resource itself. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I love the question. So we are currently in a new release train. So the API Center portal will be available in our next release publish date, which is mid-December. So from then on, we have an experience within Azure portal where users can first configure their API Center portal experience. It comes with a few of configuration things you have to set up before you're able to access it. And then we will have a link, a button for you to easily access this API Center portal based on your API Center and based on all the APIs you brought in.
Cool. Sounds simple enough. So here's another one. Do you see API Center portal as a competitor for the API developer portal in the future, or should they coexist?
Good question. We get these a lot, especially with what do customers do who have API management and API Center together. So API Center, we really see of a curated list of all of these APIs out there. A lot of our customers have multiple API management instances. So API Center comes in when you have multiple API management instances, for example, and you want to have this one list where all of your APIs are there. For example, some customers have one API management instance for only their region in Europe, another API management instance for only the US. If you want to have a curated list, then this is where API Center comes in, where you can bring in all of these APIs. And then it depends on the use case. If you want to have a portal for all of these APIs, then we would recommend, of course, using the Azure API Center portal. If you still need the developer portal coming with API management for certain regions, for certain functionalities, then we would refer to API management and developer portal here. So it depends on your use case. Feel free always to reach out if there are any more questions on this, but this is what I would give as an answer.
And then there was Sebastian had made an observation. So just looking, I guess, for some validation perhaps, but like, is there an element here of external versus internal consumers when trying to make that decision?
I love it. So as of right now, we are focusing on internal consumers developers. As a next step, we already have on our pipeline, on our roadmap, external as well. This will most likely happen after GA, but it's definitely something, some functionalities a lot of customers are bringing already to us. But again, if you have any kind of feedback, always happy to hear this. It's definitely on the roadmap here.
Okay, and one last one, and Pierce did respond here, but just we'll just show it for the recording so people can see it. And that was the API client outputs and looking for different languages. And Pierce had gave a pretty comprehensive list here, so I don't know if there's anything to add or not to this one.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's the list we have. I feel bad that I didn't show the entire process for what it looks like within Visual Studio. But yeah, these are all of the languages we support. Whatever you want your client to look like, whatever support you need, these are some of the examples we support.